Hi, everyone. Let's get started. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar on QuerySurge and DevOps for data. My name is Bill Hayduck. I'm the CEO of RTTS, the parent company of QuerySurge. This is our third in a four-part series on automating your data validation and ETL testing. Each webinar's target frame is about 30 minutes. Our goal is to keep them short and to the point, and we'll be providing the recordings of all the sessions. Eric Smythe, QuerySurge's Director of Alliances, will kick off the webinar. He'll do a short presentation on QuerySurge and DevOps for data. Mike Calabrese, the Senior Solution Architect and QuerySurge expert, will be providing a demo for us. And Rashad Evans, QuerySurge's Director of Product Support, will be answering any questions you may have. Which reminds me, if you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the Q&A panel. We'll answer as many questions as we can after Mike's demo. Also, use the chat to alert us if there are any issues seeing or hearing the session. Again, thanks for your time and participation. Now I'll hand it over to Eric to kick it off. Eric?
Thank you, Bill. Thank you all for attending. As Bill mentioned, this is the third session in a four-part session, and today's is going to focus on DevOps for data testing. We're going to start with a little QuerySurge overview and then get into specifically our DevOps for data features. So we start with the business case. So we know executives are making critical decisions based off of analytics and data reports, and the assumption is the underlying data is correct. But we know through work with partners and customers, that's not always the case. As data moves through the architecture, there's the possibility of defects being introduced, and that can affect the validity and accuracy of those reports, and that's where QuerySurge plays. We position QuerySurge as a smart testing solution for automated validation and testing of data. Our use cases are data warehouse testing, big data testing, DevOps and continuous testing, data migration testing, BI report testing, and enterprise app testing. Today, we're going to focus specifically on the DevOps and continuous testing piece. We have over 150 customers in 30 different countries. You can see a sample of our customers here, and you can see they span all different vertical markets, and they've all chosen QuerySurge as the solution to help them automate and test their data. The way QuerySurge works is we have a concept of a test, which we call a query pair, which is able to connect to any two data points at one time. So when you design the test, you'll specify your source system, which could be a traditional database, mainframe, or flat file. You'll specify a target system, which could be a data lake, data warehouse, or BI report. And at the time of execution, QuerySurge will retrieve data from both systems, bring that data back into analogous result sets, and will compare every single cell of every single record. You've been doing testing manually. You're probably only testing a small fraction of your overall data sets. With QuerySurge, you have the ability to test every record. And QuerySurge will roll all that information up into analytics and reports and send out notifications to let your team know whether there are any issues. QuerySurge connects to over 200 different data stores. You can see a sample list here, but in pretty much all cases, as long as we have network connectivity, QuerySurge can connect to that data store and bring it in for testing purposes. So today's focus is on QuerySurge's DevOps for data features. QuerySurge gives the ability to have testers be able to generate, execute, and update tests using our API. It's the first data solution, DevOps solution designed specifically for testing your data quality at speed. With over 60 API calls, it allows you to pretty much perform any action that you would need to enhance your data testing. And you can see some of the use cases listed below. QuerySurge fits seamlessly with the other products in the DevOps market space. QuerySurge tests can be triggered the same way other testing solutions can for functional or performance testing, but of course QuerySurge's focus is specifically on data testing. With the API, customers have the ability to drive their testing effort externally from the QuerySurge interface, which allows it to be easily adopted with any DevOps process. So there are commands for creating, modifying, and deleting all your QuerySurge assets, commands for execution of the various QuerySurge runs that can be driven, and QuerySurge commands to be able to retrieve the results of any of these execution, whether they're high-level summary results or more detailed results. QuerySurge provides two different ways to trigger your API calls. There is a command line API, which allows you to fire off tests through the command line interface. There is also a RESTful API call, which can be triggered pretty much from any scripting language. And these RESTful calls are self-documented with a component called Swagger, which is built into QuerySurge, which will be part of the demonstration that's conducted. And with all these features, we're able to drive QuerySurge from any type of solution that may be part of your build pipeline, whether that's your ETL tool, whether that's some type of build configuration tool, or a test management solution. And the process would look something like this, where you'd have part of your pipeline that would execute some type of ETL job. Once that job is completed, you would make the request through QuerySurge using our API to test the execution of that job to make sure that the data is correct. If QuerySurge results come back with passes, you can move on to the next step of the pipeline. If there are issues, you may run some type of rollback procedure and want to send off automatic email notifications to let team members know there is a problem. So hopefully that provides you a high-level overview of how QuerySurge works and a little bit about our DevOps component. What I'm going to do at this time is I'm going to turn it over to Michael Calabrese. He is going to be demonstrating the QuerySurge DevOps features. Take it away, Mike.
All right, thank you, Eric. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Let's see here. Welcome, everybody. As Eric mentioned, this is the third part of our webinar series here, focused in on DevOps capabilities for QuerySurge. What we're taking a look at right now is the demo instance of QuerySurge that we have up and running here. So I'm going to go ahead and log in. And what I want to do is just give a brief overview of the QuerySurge user interface here, just so when we do go to the API calls that we can see and relate them back to what we're seeing in the user interface. If this is your first time seeing QuerySurge, when you log in, you'll notice you'll be greeted by our dashboard here, which has some customizable widgets that will give you a glimpse into the certain test aspects of QuerySurge. There are also several different modules available within QuerySurge here. The one we're going to be focusing on first is the design library. Now, this is where you can develop and create your different tests in QuerySurge. And the tests in QuerySurge we call query pair. And if I open up an example of that right now, you can pretty much guess why we came up with that name. It's basically a pair of queries that go against a source data system and a target data system, extract data from both of them, and then compare results. In this particular example, we're pulling some customer and payment information, comparing the two. On our source side, we're connecting to an Oracle sales database. On our target side, we're connecting to the data warehouse. And we want to make sure that the data is lining up based on our mappings between the two systems. If I wanted to get an idea of how the data compares, I can go over to our design time run tab, and you can see some high-level information on the comparison that was run between the two. So you can see we have about 6,500 rows on our source side, the same amount on our target side, but we did have 7 failures. If I wanted to get a little bit more granular to see those 7 failures, I can click on the view query results. And what that's going to do is bring up my results window where I can see all of the source data returned, all of the target data returned, as well as any of the failures that may have occurred. So from our high-level metrics, we know that we had 7 failures there. So looking at what the results have returned, we can see that for these 7 rows, it looks like there must have been some sort of ETL issue with the credit card number between these two systems. And QuerySurge will highlight that for you here in red. Another feature that I do want to talk about is our reusable query snippets. So QuerySurge basically gives you the ability to parameterize any portion of your SQL statement that you see here. So for this test example, if I maybe wanted to cycle through some different payment types, instead of American Express, maybe I want to test the Visa credit card payment type, what I can do is I can sort of parameterize this query pair. And if I just give it a reusable query snippet a name here, what you'll see is that string American Express has now been replaced with a syntax that we use to identify reusable query snippets. They are stored also within the design library under the reusable query snippets folder here. So if I go ahead and open that up, you'll see that I can modify this value, for example, to, let's say, a Visa credit card. And if I save that and go back to my query pair, you'll notice that the value has changed to the type visa. These query snippets can be used amongst multiple query pairs, also within the same query pair itself. So if I wanted to make sure my SQL filters were aligning, I can reuse that same query pair, that same snippet within the query pair itself here. The next module I want to discuss is our scheduling module. So once you develop your query pairs for your particular test, whether it be for a specific ETL leg or a sprint that you are working on, you can group those query pairs together in what we call a test suite. So in this test suite example, the shippings and orders suite, we have 7 query pairs that are part of this suite. And I can kick off this test suite in one of 3 ways. I can right-click and select Run Now, which would immediately kick off the test suite. I can use our inbuilt scheduler to schedule, let's say, maybe for an overnight run or over the weekend when system usage may be low. Or, as we'll see momentarily, can use our API calls to kick off a particular suite run. As a demonstration, I'm just going to go ahead and kick off the shippings and orders suite now. And what that does is takes me to our run dashboard. And here we can see all of our historical scenario runs, as well as any that are actively running. So the shipping and orders scenario that I have just kicked off is currently running here. I can double click and view the individual tests for that scenario. If I were to select a particular test, you'll notice that we do get the summary results view, similar to how we were seeing in the design time run. If there are any failures, I can also view those here within the results view. So hopefully that gives you just a brief overview of the assets that we'll be working with within our API calls, which is what we're going to pivot to now. As Eric mentioned in the slides, there are 2 ways to call QuerySurge's API, one being the command line interface, the other being the RESTful API calls, which is what we're going to focus on today. So starting with QuerySurge version 7.1, we have introduced several RESTful API calls into QuerySurge's architecture. We've introduced and added a number of different calls since then, and what we're looking at is our latest version. So the nice thing about QuerySurge and the RESTful API is that documentation is embedded right in the app itself. So if you just navigate to your QuerySurge location and then add in on the end of the URL REST docs, you should be able to access our QuerySurge RESTful API documentation. Now, this is an interactive documentation that's built on the Swagger framework here, and it lists out all of the available calls that you could see. Just a note here, as you see, these 5 calls are available in the base API, so any QuerySurge version can access these. If you really want, though, the full breadth of the API calls, that will include a DevOps API license. So encourage you to, if you're interested, try out the DevOps API. You can do so for free by downloading a trial version at QuerySurge.com. And that will give you access to all of the different commands that you see here. As I mentioned, this is an interactive documentation. So one of the first things that you want to do is, if you want to try this out, we'll need to set up a session and get a QuerySurge authentication session token to be able to make these calls. This is done for security purposes so that all your data is secured and that only users with access to your QuerySurge instance should be able to extract any of the data out. Each of the calls are listed out here, and if you want to get some more information on them, you can just click into the call. And what you'll see here is, number 1, the parameters that are listed for the specific RESTful call, as well as the body, and then the expected response codes that you could see. Now we can try this out on our live QuerySurge version here by clicking the Try It Out button. I can come into our message body here, and I'm just going to use our admin login to access our QuerySurge instance. Once you have all your parameters or message body fields set, you can click the execute button, and that's going to do a couple things. It's going to send the request to the QuerySurge server. It's going to also show us the actual curl request that we could use, replicate that call. It's also going to give us the server response code, which we can see down here. So this is going to be our session ID that we'll want to continue to use now when we make subsequent API calls. So I can either copy that directly from the response body or go ahead and download that to a JSON file. One of the things that I did mention is that we can call a scenario from the RESTful API. So each of the calls that you see here are broken down by their category. So if I want to go down to our execution category, which is right here, I can execute a suite. Similar to how I did in the UI, I can do programmatically here from our RESTful API. So again, I'll just click the try it out button. The demo project that we're working with in today is lucky number 13. I also have to input my session ID for authentication purposes. And then we'll also be asked to provide the suite ID. So if I go back to my QuerySurge instance and the scheduling module, you'll notice that each of the suites here have an ID associated with them. And that's the same for all of the test assets that we'll be calling for the rest of the API. You'll notice that the query pairs themselves also have IDs associated with them. And that's a piece of information you can use programmatically when calling the API to specify which testing asset you're going to go against. So if I come back over to our Swagger documentation here, I will select suite ID 4. You can also specify a scenario name. And again, click execute. We should see return to us a 200 code, which in our documentation means that we did successfully execute a particular scenario. It's also going to give me back in a response a GUID ID, which is associated to that specific scenario. So coming back over now to QuerySurge and looking at the run dashboard, I can see that that new shipping orders scenario has run. That new API test demo has run, and we called it completely programmatically RESTful API. Additionally, I can also get information on specific scenario runs through the API. If I wanted to take a look at, let's say, the specific scenario or status, I can check on the execution status of a scenario. I can also get specific properties for a scenario, all by using that GUID ID. So as you can see, this documentation is quite extensive. Each of the calls that you have available to you are well documented in here. You can try them out on your own QuerySurge instance. And it is very useful, especially when you're going to look to develop your scripts and your API scripts that you'll want to integrate with your pipeline. What I'm going to pivot to now is sort of in a very simplified example of a pipeline run. Here, we're going to be using Jenkins to drive our DevOps pipeline. We're going to be loading in a order information via a CSV file. That's going to be loaded into a MySQL table. That's going to be leg 1 of our pipeline run. We're then going to use the RESTful API to validate that all that data has loaded successfully. If that has passed, we'll move on to leg 2, which is where we will update our BI table in our MySQL database and then verify that that data has come across as well. And if everything passes, we know that the data load was successful, and we can then say that our BI reports would then be accurate and up to date for the day's orders. If we do encounter a failure along the way, we can branch off, run a rollback job, and notify the different stakeholders as to the nature of the error, and they can provide a fix. So I'm going to go ahead right now into Jenkins and kick off my ETL pipeline run. I'm going to have to log in again. And just before I do that, let's take a look at our input that we'll be getting. So we can see we have a customer orders file here for today. Looking at it, we have about 12 records here. Switching over now to our MySQL database, we can see that all of our historical orders are populated, but have not yet loaded today's information. And similar to what we're seeing in our data warehouse table, we have everything up today. So let's go ahead and kick this build off. And what we can see here is that we have several different steps associated with this build. We're going to first run the ETL load and then kick off the subsequent QuerySurge tests. We're going to open up our session. We're going to update a specific snippet that contains the date information for this file, as well as executing the scenario and getting the results. If I take a look at the console output, we can see that the RESTful API calls that we were just showing in the Swagger documentation have been incorporated into this script. And we are passing information into QuerySurge and getting information back as to the status of our run. What we've done here as well is associated each of the runs in QuerySurge with a notification email. So each time this pipeline runs, it's going to notify the stakeholders of the status, whether it was a success or a failure. So if I come over to my QuerySurge email here, we can see that this actually has failed. We do have an issue. QuerySurge can be configured to send out specific information on your test runs. And what you're seeing here is that we definitely at the high level have some failures happening. We do see that there is a row count difference. As we were seeing in the CSV file, we have 12 rows on our source, but only 11 got loaded in. If I wanted to dig a little bit deeper, I can click on this link and that will take me directly into the QuerySurge scenario where we can view the granular results here. So if I were a tester or maybe a developer, I can come in here and maybe do some analysis, maybe see what exactly has gone wrong. And looking at the two failures here, it appears that we have an issue with our date column. Looks like the time has been offset by an hour. And we can also see down at the bottom here that we do have a row that was present in our CSV file, but not in our target database. So we can then take that information, notify our stakeholders, and then make a determination as to what the proper fix should be. Luckily for us, for our demo purposes, our developers work very quickly, so we are able to get and implement a ETL fix. So let me just update our build number here, and we'll go ahead and kick that off again. And in this example, we should now see a successful run. So as the leg one is running now, what we should see is a successful pipeline pass all the way through to our leg one, to our data mart in leg two, and then both of these validations in QuerySurge should pass. Just a side note here, as you can see, we are using CSV files to load in and populate our example here. If you do work with flat files or CSV files and you're interested to see how QuerySurge can work with them, I would suggest attending next week's webinar session where my colleague Rashad will be talking about how QuerySurge can work with and deal with flat files. So as we can see, leg one now has successfully passed. We will get a notification that our job has passed. Everything looks good for leg one. Shortly, we should see leg two pass. And if we check our database, see that today's orders, all 12 of them have been updated. Looks like the dates are looking good. And that then completes our pipeline run successfully. You can see that in Jenkins, we've pass that information back. Everything looks good. And that is all done programmatically within QuerySurge here. So you can see that our pipeline runs have been successfully executed, both the daily load with everything passed, as well as the BI data load. So just a very simple and straightforward example of how you can integrate QuerySurge within your DevOps pipelines. If you are interested in experimenting with this for yourself, I would strongly suggest going to QuerySurge.com, downloading a free trial. Our DevOps API is available to you within those free trials. And I think that will pretty much do it. So with that, I will open up the floor to any questions we may have received during the demo.
Thanks, Mike. Rashad Evans, QuerySurge's Director of Product Support, is now going to answer any questions. If you have them, please type them in the Q&A window, and he'll get to them as quickly as he can.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Mike. Great presentation. I'm going to rifle through these questions. If I do not get to your question today, we will do our best to get back to you offline with the response to your question. The first question that we have is the RESTful option comes with the DevOps add-on only, correct? But does the command line call is the base API, which is already included? So the answer to this question is that it used to be the case that the RESTful API only came with the DevOps add-on. Now, with the last several releases, you get the same base API calls that were command line calls in a RESTful version. So in the latest versions, if you were to download and you do not have the DevOps add-on, you can make RESTful calls using the same base API command line calls. So we did open up that offering for the base API. The next question is, does a user's project role limit the REST commands that can be executed by that user? The answer to that is yes and no. If the user is a read-only or participant user, then yes, the user cannot execute any of these REST commands. However, any other user type, whether it be a full user, admin, or a full user standard user, they will be able to send these commands and run the REST API calls. The next question is, are there any other APIs that you offer for DevOps implementations? And the answer to that question is yes, we do offer other APIs, namely the RESTful API that Mike showed you today. But we do have other API solutions. As I mentioned, the base API comes with a limited number of calls, which is a subset of the DevOps API calls, both available in command line form and RESTful form. But we also offer what we call test management solutions and connectors to those test management solutions, namely Micro Focus's ALM, IBM's RQM, and Microsoft's Azure DevOps. We have deep integrations with these test management tool connectors that we offer to those solutions. The next question is, are there any limits to the number of requests that can be made? And the answer to that simply is no, there are no limits. Obviously, there are hardware limits to what the application can handle in terms of the requests if you're spitting them out relatively quickly and for a long period of time. But other than that, from an application perspective, there are no limits. Does a user's project, the next question is, what programming languages do you support for writing API calls? And the answer to that is your favorite programming language. If you are using the command line API, you simply need to have the capability to call into either a batch file or a shell script if you're running on Linux. But you can program your custom code and workflow in any programming language that you like. So if you wanted to develop your custom workflows in Java or Python, or Ruby, you can certainly do so as long as you have the capability to either make a RESTful call with a RESTful library, or you can call into a command line via a shell script or a command line on Windows. Is there any documentation on how to set up pipelines in DevOps to run the QS tests? There is some documentation on our knowledge base. We have a fully fledged knowledge base with over 200 articles describing several different types of topics of how to set up connections to how to set up pipelines in DevOps. If this is referring to Azure DevOps, then yes, we do have documentation on our knowledge base, and you can simply access the knowledge base from the QuerySurge application or going to querysurge.zendesk.com. The next question is, are there any tool sets that the DevOps offerings integrates with? So yes, if you wanted to set up your custom pipelines, what you could do is essentially integrate this with anything external to QuerySurge, like a scheduling or coordination tool such as Windows Scheduler or Linux cron, or if you have an enterprise tool like Cisco Title, you can certainly integrate the execution and the calling of the tests in QuerySurge from those tool sets. ETL tools like Informatica, Ab Initio, SSIS, and the like, or DevOps and continuous delivery tools like Jenkins, which Mike just showed you, or Electric Cloud and Bamboo. And I think that's all the time we have for questions today. There were some additional questions, but as I mentioned earlier, we'll do our best to get back to you individually on those questions.
Great. Well, thanks, Eric, Mike, and Rashad. That wraps up our Q&A session. Thanks again, everyone, for your time and participation. Feel free to join our final webinar in this 4-part series. It's on flat files. It's next Thursday, October 7th. And also, we'll be sending a follow-up email to you with a link to the recording of this session and all the other sessions. So thank you very much for your time, and have a great rest of your day.